The arena cheered for heroes. But behind closed doors, women endured fear, silence, and secret suffering, revealing the brutal, hidden cost of every gladiator's victory in ancient Rome's deadly spectacle. The arena has fallen silent, the crowds have gone home, and the sand remains dark with the stains of blood. Yet the real story of Rome's gladiatorial spectacle begins not when the spectators cheer, but when the gates close and the torches flicker low, revealing a hidden, far harsher reality. While most people grow up believing that victory nights were moments of celebration, reward, and indulgence, the truth was far more complex, steeped in structured control, fear, and unspoken hierarchy, particularly affecting women who lived, worked, or were brought into the barracks. Enslaved women were rendered invisible, forced into labor that involved cooking, cleaning, and tending to injuries without complaint, their survival dependent on complete silence and strict obedience, as any form of resistance was met with punishment, humiliation, or even death. Contracted women, often drawn from brothels through formal agreements, were similarly trapped. Their labor benefited others, their personal freedom limited, and refusal of a gladiator's attention could result in breaches of contract, fines, or retaliation. Even free women, drawn by curiosity, excitement, or social ambition, discovered that social status and privilege meant nothing within the enclosed world of the barracks. The illusion of glory disguised coercion, and tradition normalized entitlement, ensuring that a man's victory granted him authority over others, while suffering was rendered invisible. Alcohol, ego, and the trappings of apparent reward created a dangerous environment in which injuries, intimidation, and psychological strain were routine, yet carefully hidden from public view. Rome celebrated the heroism of gladiators while erasing the human cost of their triumphs, transforming suffering into invisible currency, and enforcing a silent culture that required women to endure, resist quietly, and survive in a world that publicly lauded men but privately demanded compliance, obedience, and submission. Victory nights were not festive occasions, but rather deliberate, ritualized events designed to reinforce power, hierarchy, and control, and the women who lived through them bore the consequences in ways that history would only now begin to acknowledge, clearer than in the treatment of gladiators and the women around them. Gladiators were meticulously trained, carefully managed, and treated as assets whose value extended far beyond the arena, their every movement, meal, and fight calculated to maximize spectacle, profit, and public fascination. Their success was tightly controlled, yet it came at a tremendous hidden cost for the women who lived, worked, or were brought into proximity with them. Enslaved women had no legal identity, no voice, and no ability to refuse the demands placed upon them. Their labor, care, and compliance were compulsory, and failure to obey was met with punishment or worse. Contracted women, often bound by agreements controlled by others, found themselves trapped, as refusal or resistance could carry penalties, fines, or the threat of further subjugation. Even free women who entered the barracks seeking excitement, romance, or personal reward discovered that social class, wealth, or status meant nothing in the enclosed world of victory nights, where the rules were unspoken but universally understood. The victor was entitled to access, silence ensured survival, and compliance was mandatory. Archaeological evidence reinforces this reality, revealing skeletal trauma, hidden chambers, and structural designs meant to control rather than comfort. These nights were far from chaotic indulgences. They were planned, calculated, and ritualized extensions of the arena's violence, in which women endured, resisted quietly, and survived in a society that praised public heroism while concealing the human cost behind closed doors. The system ensured that power remained in the hands of the victor, while the suffering of others went unrecorded, sanitized, or erased. Victory nights were therefore not festive occasions, but carefully orchestrated mechanisms to reward male success while hiding the consequences for those around them, illustrating the deeply ingrained hierarchy, entitlement, and control at the heart of Roman culture, and emphasizing the endurance, resilience, and silent suffering of the women who lived through these nights, whose stories have only recently begun to emerge from the shadows of history. Gladiators were the ultimate celebrities of Rome, admired and idolized for their strength, courage, and unmatched skill in the arena. But public admiration did not equate to respect, and desire did not mean consent, particularly for the women who surrounded them in victory nights. Graffiti on walls, poems whispered in corridors, and stories passed by word of mouth celebrated their heroism and physical prowess, creating fantasies that elevated them in the eyes of society, while simultaneously granting them unchecked authority behind the closed doors of the barracks. Every triumph in the arena was more than a matter of survival or fame. It was a transaction of power, where a cheer from the crowd became a signal of entitlement. A trophy was a mark of access, and every victory carried a human cost hidden from public perception. Enslaved women were tasked with constant labor, cooking, cleaning, and tending to gladiators' wounds under a rigid system where refusal meant punishment, while contracted women, brought in through agreements benefiting owners rather than themselves, had little freedom to resist. Even free women who sought adventure, romance, or thrill discovered that their social standing offered no protection once inside the barracks, leaving them vulnerable to the authority assumed by victorious men. Rome's culture framed these nights as traditional rewards, as natural consequences of heroism, and as a rightful privilege of the victor. But the underlying reality was coercion masked as celebration. Alcohol, inflated egos, and the illusion of glory combined to create an environment where physical injuries and psychological trauma were common, yet systematically hidden. Archaeological evidence now reveals the hidden cost: bones showing defensive wounds, secret chambers beneath barracks, and burial sites indicating repeated trauma. These findings confirm that victory nights were not innocent festivities, but organized, normalized extensions of the arena's brutality, transferring the burden from combatants to those with no power, no protection, and no voice. Behind the spectacle and applause, women endured the consequences quietly, embodying resilience and survival in a society that glorified champions while hiding the true human cost of their triumphs. Victory nights followed unwritten but universally understood rules, granting gladiators privileges that went far beyond public recognition or applause, creating a system in which winning the arena translated directly into access, authority, and control, particularly over the women present. For enslaved women, there was no possibility of consent. Their bodies, labor, and lives were considered property, and refusal was neither tolerated nor safe. Contracted women were bound to agreements dictated by others, leaving them little choice, while free women quickly learned that status, privilege, or social reputation offered no protection once the barracks doors closed. These nights were designed to ensure that the victor's desires were met while the public remained oblivious, the spectacle presenting triumph and celebration while concealing coercion and fear. Alcohol, ego, and the illusion of reward amplified the power imbalance, creating an environment in which physical injuries, emotional trauma, and threats of punishment were routine, yet carefully hidden from view. Resistance was dangerous. Even fleeting defiance could result in serious consequences, and silence became the only viable strategy for survival. Archaeological evidence now reveals the hidden structure behind this violence. Defensive wounds on bones, secret chambers for confinement, and burial sites showing repeated trauma confirm that these events were neither spontaneous nor accidental, but deliberate, normalized, and ritualized extensions of the arena's brutality. What modern audiences may perceive as celebration, indulgence, or even romance was, in reality, a calculated continuation of oppression, transferring the costs of victory from gladiators to those who had no power, no legal recourse, and no protection. Women were forced to endure these nights quietly, their suffering hidden behind the spectacle, their voices suppressed, and their existence rendered invisible. Victory nights, therefore, were far from innocent festivities. They were a reflection of the systemic, deeply ingrained inequalities of Roman society, a dark underside to the grandeur of gladiatorial fame, and a chilling reminder that heroism in the arena came at the expense of those whose lives were controlled and dominated in the shadows, emphasizing that the cost of victory was rarely borne by the victor alone, but by the powerless who surrounded him, reinforcing customs that benefited the victor and preserved the appearance of order while ignoring human suffering. Presence in the barracks was often interpreted as consent, silence as agreement, and even when legal proceedings occurred, they rarely addressed personal harm, focusing instead on property damage, social reputation, or financial consequences. Champions were too valuable to punish, too adored by the crowds, and too central to the empire's image of strength and spectacle to face accountability, even in cases where assault, injury, or death were undeniable. This legal framework made clear that entertainment and profit were prioritized over morality, and that the suffering of women was considered an acceptable and even necessary cost to uphold the system of reward and spectacle. Enforcement of laws and customs, combined with societal expectation, ensured that victory nights continued as extensions of the arena's violence, where women silently bore the weight of entitlement and power. These legal and social structures were designed to protect the victor while erasing or minimizing the consequences for those affected, leaving women trapped in a cycle of exploitation from which there was little escape. By upholding tradition, enforcing silence, and framing submission as part of social expectation, the empire created a system in which male authority was absolute and unchallenged. Women's labor, presence, and bodies were effectively commodified, their autonomy denied, and their suffering rendered invisible to historians and contemporaries alike. The combination of law, custom, and social control maintained a rigid hierarchy, ensuring that victory nights remained consistent, expected, and feared events. Through this system, the empire masked the brutality that occurred in private, while publicly celebrating the heroism of gladiators. The silence surrounding these women's experiences allowed the illusion of glory to persist, hiding the dark realities of coercion, fear, and control. Their endurance and survival, though often invisible, underscore the hidden human cost behind the celebrated victories that Rome glorified for centuries, revealing a society that rewarded power without accountability and normalized suffering as part of tradition. Rarely, however, resistance broke through the silence, revealing the courage and resilience of women who refused to accept the oppressive structure of victory nights. Both enslaved and free women occasionally disrupted routines, challenged authority, or resisted participation in the systems that controlled their lives, exposing cracks in the rigid hierarchy that dictated the barracks. Such acts of defiance were dangerous, and the consequences were often severe. punishment could range from physical violence and public humiliation to imprisonment or even death. Yet these rare moments of resistance, however fleeting, demonstrated the human capacity to confront power, challenge injustice, and assert agency despite overwhelming risk. Authorities, aware of the potential for disruption, responded with swift measures to restore control, implementing limited reforms, increasing supervision, and adjusting contracts or operations just enough to prevent further revolt, while maintaining the spectacle and public illusion of victory nights. The cost of defiance was high, but even small acts left lasting marks, forcing the system to adapt and acknowledging the presence of human will within a structure designed to erase it. Women's resistance, while often invisible in historical texts, left traces in legal records, structural modifications, and anecdotal accounts that reveal a subtle, ongoing struggle against oppression. The balance of power remained heavily skewed toward the victor, but these moments show that survival was not simply passive endurance. It involved calculated choices, courage, and the quiet assertion of dignity in the face of coercion. Despite systemic suppression, these acts of defiance underscored the fragility of absolute control, demonstrating that even within a society built on fear, ritualized violence, and normalized abuse, human agency persisted. Victory nights, therefore, were not only a continuation of arena violence, but also a stage where power was negotiated, challenged, and occasionally resisted, highlighting the complex interplay between oppression and courage that shaped the hidden lives of women behind Rome's celebrated spectacles. Their bravery, often overlooked, stands as a testament to resilience in the darkest conditions. Despite these moments of resistance, history largely erased the experiences of women, leaving their suffering, endurance, and courage largely absent from written records, legal texts, and popular accounts. Chroniclers, historians, and lawmakers focused overwhelmingly on gladiators, their techniques, strategies, and public spectacle, while the lives of the women who lived, worked, or were compelled to participate in victory nights were relegated to silence. Archaeological discoveries have only recently begun to fill these gaps, revealing hidden chambers, skeletal evidence of repeated trauma, and structural traces that indicate systematic abuse and coercion long ignored by historical narratives. The empire depended on selective memory, celebrating the heroism of men while erasing the cost borne by those whose labor, presence, and bodies made the spectacle possible. Women's lives were tightly controlled, their choices restricted, and their suffering deliberately hidden, so that public fascination could remain focused on victory, spectacle, and glory. Modern audiences, captivated by tales of gladiators, often overlook this omission, failing to recognize that the story of ancient Rome's arenas was incomplete without acknowledging the human cost borne by women behind the scenes. These women endured coercion, fear, and physical and psychological harm, navigating complex hierarchies of power in which survival demanded silence, compliance, and careful strategy. Their endurance, though invisible in traditional histories, reflects both resilience and the harsh realities of a society structured to favor male power and entertainment above all else. Archaeology now challenges the sanitized versions of history, confirming that behind every triumph lay suffering and exploitation, and that the public narrative of glory was constructed at the expense of women who were systematically marginalized, silenced, and erased. By examining these hidden lives, we gain a fuller understanding of the empire's priorities, the normalization of coercion, and the silent heroism of women whose survival and quiet resistance form an essential, though historically neglected, part of the story of Roman victory nights and the human consequences of celebrated triumphs, entitlement, and control, yet presented publicly as celebrations of triumph and heroism. The reality for women involved, however, was far harsher, consisting of coercion, exploitation, and a rigid system that normalized abuse under the guise of tradition. Women were categorized according to their social status, legal standing, and purpose, with enslaved women bearing the brunt of labor and control, contracted women bound by agreements that limited freedom, and free women discovering that status offered no protection once inside the barracks. Their presence was expected, their compliance enforced, and resistance actively suppressed, making obedience not just necessary, but a critical strategy for survival. The system was not chaotic. Rather, it was ritualized and carefully orchestrated to ensure that a gladiator's victory carried tangible consequences for those around him, particularly women whose bodies and labor were treated as extensions of male entitlement. Silence became a survival tool, submission a requirement, and escape a rare and dangerous possibility. The public, meanwhile, saw only spectacle and celebration, never the hidden costs endured behind the closed doors of the barracks. Alcohol, the illusion of reward, and the heightened status of the victor combined to create a perilous environment in which coercion, intimidation, and physical or emotional injury were normalized yet invisible. Archaeological and historical evidence reveals that this system was deeply entrenched. Skeletal trauma, structural designs, and burial sites indicate repeated patterns of abuse that were not isolated events, but organized extensions of the arena's violence. Victory nights, therefore, were more than social gatherings. They were a calculated mechanism to reinforce hierarchy, entitlement, and male dominance, while masking the suffering of those powerless to resist. The women who lived through these nights endured the invisible consequences of triumph, quietly navigating the complex and dangerous dynamics imposed upon them, ensuring their survival in a world that celebrated gladiators, while deliberately erasing the human cost that allowed their fame, power, and public glory to exist, authority in private that extended far beyond fame or prize money, particularly over the lives of women present during victory nights. Their victories in the arena translated into a form of social power that allowed them to exert control over those around them, dictating labor, attention, and compliance. Enslaved women were forced into invisible labor, tasked with cleaning, cooking, and tending to gladiators' needs, their autonomy stripped away, and their survival dependent on obedience. Contracted women, bound by agreements arranged by others, had little choice but to comply, as refusal could lead to severe penalties, loss of livelihood, or exposure to violence. Even free women, drawn by curiosity, excitement, or the promise of romance, quickly discovered that privilege, status, or social standing offered no protection in the enclosed, ritualized environment of the barracks. Victory nights created a space where the powerful were celebrated, and the powerless became invisible, ensuring that the brutality of the arena continued off-stage, hidden from the public eye, yet systematic and enduring. Archaeological evidence, legal documents, and historical records confirm patterns of trauma, coercion, and abuse, showing that these events were not isolated incidents, but part of an organized system designed to reinforce hierarchy, entitlement, and male dominance. Women's bodies, labor, and presence were treated as extensions of the victor's privilege, and the consequences for them were often severe, hidden, and deliberately ignored. The spectacle that fascinated the public concealed the calculated oppression behind it, where survival relied on silence, compliance, and careful navigation of dangerous social dynamics. These nights ensured that the fame, power, and glory of gladiators came at a measurable human cost, particularly to women whose lives were shaped, constrained, and exploited to uphold the illusion of triumph. In this system, the continuation of arena violence into private spaces, underscores the deliberate and enduring nature of control, coercion, and the silencing of those powerless to resist, highlighting a hidden, darker reality behind every celebrated victory: abuse. Presence in the barracks was assumed to indicate consent, while silence was taken as compliance, leaving women with little to no recourse if they resisted or were harmed. The legal system prioritized reputation, property, and profit over personal suffering, ensuring that those who wielded power faced minimal accountability. Punishments for resistance, violation, or abuse were rare, while victories in the arena amplified the gladiator's authority, prestige, and access, further entrenching systemic imbalance. This legal and social framework normalized coercion, rewarded dominance, and erased accountability, reinforcing the conditions that allowed victory nights to continue as extensions of arena violence. Women bore this burden silently, navigating a world where laws, traditions, and social expectations all worked to maintain male authority and suppress dissent. Their experiences, largely absent from historical records, reflect a deliberate erasure that prioritized spectacle over justice, glory over human cost. The combination of law and custom ensured that the hierarchy remained intact, making clear that the enjoyment of triumph by gladiators and spectators depended upon the subjugation of those with little power. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates the enduring patterns of coercion, trauma, and systemic control that characterize these events, revealing the invisible labor and suffering required to sustain the illusion of public celebration. The lived experiences of women during victory nights illustrate the intersection of law, culture, and power, showing how social structures protected privilege while punishing those who resisted. By understanding this system, it becomes evident that the celebrated triumphs of Rome were inseparable from the oppression endured in private, and that the human cost of glory extended beyond the arena itself, shaping the lives of women who navigated survival, coercion, and silenced resistance in a society that glorified power and normalized suffering. The human cost of victory nights extended beyond individual events, reflecting the broader structure of Roman society in which women's labor, freedom, and safety were subordinated to entertainment, profit, and the projection of power. Enslaved women were compelled to perform essential tasks, from cleaning and cooking to attending the wounds and personal needs of gladiators, all under strict oversight and the constant threat of punishment. Contracted women were bound by agreements designed to benefit others, often leaving them with no ability to refuse demands without risking severe consequences. Even free women, drawn by curiosity or the allure of thrill and excitement, quickly realized that social standing and privilege offered no protection once inside the controlled environment of the barracks. Resistance was rare and dangerous, and those who attempted it often faced retaliation designed to reinforce authority and suppress defiance, ensuring that the system remained largely unchallenged. Archaeological evidence underscores the organized and systematic nature of these events. Skeletal trauma, hidden rooms, and repeated patterns of coercion across sites reveal that victory nights were deliberate extensions of the arena's brutality rather than spontaneous indulgences. The empire depended on invisible labor and the silent suffering of women to sustain the illusion of glory and spectacle, hiding the cost from the public while rewarding male triumph. Even minimal reforms or adaptations that occasionally followed acts of resistance were designed not to protect women, but to preserve the system itself, ensuring the continuation of hierarchy and control. Victory nights thus served as both spectacle and mechanism of oppression, reflecting deeply ingrained societal priorities that valued power, performance, and entertainment over human dignity. The women who endured these events did so in silence, navigating a perilous landscape where survival required obedience, vigilance, and subtle resistance, making clear that the human consequences of victory were inseparable from the social and structural systems that enabled Rome's celebrated spectacles to flourish. Through it all, history largely ignored the victims of victory nights, focusing instead on gladiators, their techniques, and the spectacle of combat, leaving women's experiences virtually absent from traditional accounts. Chroniclers celebrated heroism, skill, and public entertainment while neglecting evidence of suffering, abuse, and coercion endured behind closed doors. Archaeology has begun to fill these gaps, revealing hidden quarters, skeletal trauma, and structural evidence that point to systematic exploitation and oppression long overlooked or deliberately omitted from historical narratives. Women's lives were tightly controlled, their choices constrained, and their labor and presence treated as tools to maintain the illusion of glory for gladiators and the empire. Silence became a necessary strategy for survival, and endurance a daily practice, as any attempt to assert autonomy could result in punishment, retaliation, or further marginalization. The empire's selective memory depended on erasing the cost of entertainment, ensuring that public fascination remained focused solely on triumph, spectacle, and male heroism, while the suffering that enabled these displays remained invisible. Modern fascination with gladiators often fails to question this omission, overlooking the structural violence and coercion that sustained the spectacle. The evidence now emerging demonstrates that the celebrated victories of Rome were inseparable from the oppression and exploitation of women who lived, worked, or were compelled into participation, highlighting the hidden human cost behind the illusion of glory. These women endured in silence, navigating fear, labor, and social pressure, and sometimes resisted subtly, revealing resilience and courage that history largely overlooked. By studying their experiences, scholars gain a more complete understanding of Roman society, where triumph and spectacle were built on the subjugation of those without power, and where the human consequences of entertainment were deliberately concealed. Victory nights were therefore not merely celebrations, but carefully orchestrated mechanisms of social control, reflecting the intersection of power, gender, and survival, and exposing the enduring, often invisible, suffering that allowed Rome's heroes to shine in public, while oppression persisted in private. Fragility of power in Roman society. When enslaved or free women disrupted routines, refused participation, or openly challenged authority within the barracks, they forced the system to respond, exposing the mechanisms that maintained control over their lives. These moments were dangerous, as punishment could be swift and severe, ranging from physical violence and humiliation to the permanent loss of freedom or life. Yet these acts of resistance, however small, left traces that demonstrated the presence of agency in an environment designed to suppress it. Authorities often reacted with limited reforms, increased oversight, or modifications to contracts, not to protect women, but to prevent further disruption and ensure the continuation of victory nights as spectacles of male triumph. The cost of defiance was high, but the persistence of resistance, however minimal, underscores that women were not merely passive participants in a system of exploitation. They strategically navigated danger, employed subtle forms of rebellion, and asserted human dignity where possible. Archaeological and textual evidence supports this, showing modifications in barracks layouts, variations in supervision, and traces of actions meant to circumvent coercion. These acts, though rarely recorded in historical narratives, demonstrate that power was contested and that survival required vigilance, courage, and adaptability. Victory nights, therefore, were not only events of spectacle and coercion, but also arenas of negotiation and resistance, where women's agency, though constrained, occasionally challenged authority. Their defiance, though largely invisible in history, leaves a testament to the complexity of human behavior under oppression. It emphasizes that behind every celebrated gladiatorial victory, there existed a shadowed struggle in which women endured, resisted, and shaped the boundaries of power and control, revealing a hidden dimension of Roman society in which courage persisted even under extreme duress. Finally, when we reflect on the legacy of gladiators, it is impossible to separate their fame and victories from the unseen consequences endured by the women around them. Celebration, reward, and honor constituted only one side of the story. The other side belonged to women whose lives were controlled, their choices erased, and their suffering hidden behind the grandeur of spectacle. Rome's obsession with hierarchy, spectacle, and tradition created a system in which victory nights extended the brutality of the arena into private spaces, ensuring that those without power, enslaved, contracted, or free women, paid a human cost invisible to spectators. Archaeological evidence, legal documents, and historical accounts collectively confirm a reality deliberately obscured from glorified narratives. Bones bearing trauma, hidden quarters for confinement, and repeated signs of coercion illustrate the organized nature of oppression. Women endured in silence, navigating a landscape of fear, expectation, and social obligation, where survival depended on compliance, subtle resistance, and careful strategy. Their experiences, long ignored in historical accounts, underscore the human cost of Rome's celebrated heroes and the societal structures that enabled them to thrive publicly while perpetuating suffering privately. Victory nights were therefore not mere extensions of entertainment. They were calculated events that reinforced power hierarchies, normalized coercion, and demanded obedience from those who lacked protection. The endurance and quiet resistance of these women reveal a hidden layer of history, showing that the consequences of triumph were distributed unevenly, with the powerless bearing the brunt. Their stories, now emerging through archaeology and scholarly research, serve as a powerful reminder that glory always carries a cost, often invisible, and that the celebrated triumphs of Rome were inseparable from the suffering, labor, and courage of women, whose lives were manipulated and controlled to uphold the illusion of victory. In acknowledging their experiences, we confront the true legacy of the arena, a spectacle of heroism built upon unseen sacrifice, enduring coercion, and silent resilience that shaped the very history Rome sought to glorify.